Chapter 11. Hang on, R2, Luke called as the first gusts of atmospheric turbulence began to bounce the X-Wing around. We're coming in! Scanners all working okay? There was an affirmative twitter from the rear, the translation appearing across his computer scope. Good, Luke said, and turned his attention back to the cloud-shrouded planet rushing up to meet them. It was odd, he thought, how it had only been on that first trip into Dagobah that the sensors had so totally failed on approach. Or perhaps not so odd. Perhaps that had been Yoda, deliberately suppressing his instruments so as to be able to guide him unsuspectingly to the proper landing site. And now Yoda was gone. Firmly, Luke put the thought out of his mind. Mourning the loss of a friend and teacher was both fitting and honorable, but to dwell unnecessarily on that loss was to give the past too much power over the present. The X-Wing dropped into the lower atmosphere, and within seconds was completely enveloped by thick white clouds. Luke watched the instruments, taking the approach slow and easy. The last time he'd come here, just before the Battle of Endor, he'd made the landing without incident, but just the same, he had no intention of pushing his luck. The landing sensors had Yoda's old homestead pinpointed now. R2, he called. Find me a good level spot to set down, will you? In response, a red rectangle appeared on the forward scope, a ways east of the house, but within walking distance of it. Thanks, Luke told the droid, and keyed in the landing cycle. A moment later, with one last mad flurry of displaced tree branches, they were down. Slipping off his helmet, Luke popped the canopy. The rich odors of the Dagobah swamp flooded in on him, a strange combination of sweet and decay that sent 100 memories flashing through his mind. That slow twitch of Yoda's ears, the strange but tasty stew he'd often made, the way that wispy hair of his had tickled Luke's ears whenever he rode on Luke's back during training, the training itself, the long hours, the physical and mental fatigue, the gradually increasing sense of and confidence in the Force, the cave and its dark side images. The cave. Abruptly, Luke stood up in the cockpit, hand going reflexively to his lightsaber as he peered through the haze. Surely he hadn't brought his X-Wing down by the cave. He had. There, no more than 50 meters away, was the tree that grew from just above that evil place, its huge blackened shape jutting upward through the surrounding trees. Beneath and between its tangled roots, just visible through the mists and shorter vegetation, he could see the dark entrance to the cave itself. Wonderful, he muttered. Just wonderful. From behind him came an interrogative set of beeps. Never mind, R2, he called over his shoulder, dropping his helmet back onto the seat. It's all right. Why don't you stay here and I'll... The X-Wing rocked just a bit, and he looked back to find R2 already out of his socket and working his way gingerly forward. Or if you'd rather, you can come along, he added wryly. R2 beeped again. Not a cheerful beep exactly, but one that definitely sounded relieved. The little droid hated being left alone. Hang on, Luke directed him. I'll get down and give you a hand. He jumped down. The ground felt a little squishy beneath his feet, but it was easily firm enough to support the X-Wing's weight. Satisfied, he reached out with the Force to lift R2 from his perch and lower the droid to the ground beside him. There you go, he said. From off in the distance came the long, trilling wail of one of Dagobah's birds. Luke listened as it ran down the scale, eyes searching the swamp around him and wondering why exactly he'd come here. Back on Coruscant it had seemed important, even vital, that he do so. But now that he was actually standing here, it all seemed hazy. Hazy and more than a little silly. Beside him, R2 beeped questioningly. With an effort, Luke shook off his uncertainties. I thought Yoda might have left something behind that we could use, he told the droid, choosing the most easily verbalized of his reasons. The house should be... He glanced around to get his bearings. That way. Let's go. The distance wasn't great, But the trip took longer than Luke had anticipated. Partly it was the general terrain and vegetation. He'd forgotten just how difficult it was to get from one place to another through the Dagobah swamps. But there was something else, too. A low-level but persistent pressure at the back of his mind that seemed to press inward, clouding his ability to think. But at last they arrived, to find the house effectively gone. For a long minute Luke just stood there, gazing at the massive vegetation occupying the spot where the house had been, a freshly renewed sense of loss struggling against the embarrassing realization that he'd been a fool. Growing up in the deserts of Tatooine, where an abandoned structure could last for half a century or more, it had somehow never even occurred to him to consider what would happen to that same structure after 5 years in a swamp. Beside him, R2 twittered a question. "I thought Yoda might have left some tapes or books behind," Luke explained. "Something that would tell me more about the methods of Jedi training. Not much left, though, is there?" In response, R2 extended his little sensor plate. "Never mind," Luke told him, starting forward. "As long as we're here, I guess we might as well take a look." It took only a few minutes to cut a path through the bushes and vines with his lightsaber and to reach what was left of the house's outer walls. For the most part, they were rubble, reaching only to his waist at their highest, and covered with a crisscrossing of tiny vines. Inside was more vegetation, pushing up against and in some places through the old stone hearth. Half buried in the mud were Yoda's old iron pots, covered with strange-looking moss. Behind him, R2 gave a quiet whistle. "No, I don't think we're going to find anything useful," Luke agreed, squatting down to pull one of the pots out of the ground. A small lizard darted out as he did so and disappeared into the reedy grass. "R2, see if you can find anything electronic around here, will you? I never saw him use anything like that, but—" He shrugged. The droid obediently raised his sensor plate again. Luke watched as it tracked back and forth, and suddenly stopped. "Find something?" Luke asked. R2 twittered excitedly, his dome swiveling to look back the way they'd come. "Back that way?" Luke frowned. He looked down at the debris around him. "Not here." R2 beeped again and turned around, rolling with some difficulty across the uneven surface. Pausing, he swiveled his dome back towards Luke and made a series of sounds that could only have been a question. "Okay, I'm coming," Luke sighed, forcing back the odd sense of dread that had suddenly seized him. "Lead the way." The sunlight filtering through the leafy canopy overhead had become noticeably dimmer by the time they came within sight of the X-Wing. "Now where?" Luke asked R2. "I hope you're not going to tell me that all you were picking up was our own ship." R2 swiveled his dome back around, trilling a decidedly indignant denial. His sensor plate turned slightly, to point directly at the cave. Luke swallowed hard. "You're sure?" The droid trilled again. "You're sure," Luke said. For a minute he just looked across through the mists at the cave, indecision swirling through his mind. There was no genuine need for him to go in there. Of that much he was certain. Whatever it was R2 had detected, it would not be anything Yoda had left behind. Not in there. But then what was it? Leia had referred to a Biphashi dark Jedi who'd come here. Could it be something of his? Luke gritted his teeth. "Stay here, R2, he instructed the droid as he started to cross to the cave. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Fear and anger, Yoda had often warned him, were the slaves of the dark side. Vaguely, Luke wondered which side curiosity served. Up close, the tree straddling the cave looked as evil as he remembered it. Twisted, dark, and vaguely brooding, as if it was itself alive with the dark side of the Force. Perhaps it was. Luke couldn't tell for sure, not with the overwhelming emanations of the cave flooding his senses. It was clearly the source of the low-level pressure he'd felt ever since his arrival on Dagobah, and for a moment he wondered why the effect had never been this strong before. Perhaps because Yoda had always been here before, his presence shielding Luke from the true strength of the cave's power. But now Yoda was gone, and Luke was facing the cave alone. He took a deep breath. I am a Jedi, he reminded himself firmly. Slipping his comm link from his belt, he thumbed it on. R2, you copy? The comm link trilled back. Okay, I'm starting in. Give me a signal when I get close to whatever it is you're picking up. He got an affirmative sounding beep. Returning the comm link to his belt, he drew his lightsaber. Taking another deep breath, he ducked under the gnarled tree roots and stepped into the cave. This, too, was as bad as he remembered it. Dark, dank, alive with skittering insects and slimy plants, it was generally as unpleasant a place as Luke had ever been in. The footing seemed more treacherous than it had been before, and twice in the first dozen steps he nearly fell on his face as the ground gave way beneath his weight. Not badly, but enough to throw him off balance. Through the mists ahead, a well-remembered spot loomed, and he found himself gripping his lightsaber all the more tightly as he neared it. On this spot, once, he'd fought a nightmare battle with a shadowy, unreal Darth Vader. He reached the place and stopped, fighting back the fear and memories. But this time, to his relief, nothing happened. No hissing breath came from the shadows. No Dark Lord glided forward to confront him. Nothing. Luke licked his lips and pulled the comlink off his belt. No, of course there would be nothing. He had already faced that crisis. Had faced it and conquered it. With Vader redeemed and gone, the cave had nothing further to threaten him with except nameless and unreal fears, and those only if he allowed them to have power over him. He should have realized that from the start. R2, he called. You still there? The little droid buzzed in reply. All right, Luke said, starting forward again. How far do I have to... And right in the middle of his sentence, practically in the middle of a step, the haze of the cave abruptly coalesced around him into a flickering, surreal vision. He was on a small, open-air ground vehicle, hovering low over some sort of pit. The ground itself was indistinct, but he could feel a terrible heat rising all around him from it. Something poked hard in his back, urging him forward onto a narrow board protruding horizontally from the vehicle's side. Luke caught his breath, the scene suddenly coming clear. He was back on Jabba the Hutt's skiff, being prepared for his execution in the great pit of Carkoon. Ahead, he could see the shape of Jabba's sail barge now, drifting a bit closer as the courtiers jostled one another for a better view of the coming spectacle. Many of the barge's details were indistinct through the dream mists, but he could see clearly the small dome-topped figure of R2 at the top of the ship, awaiting Luke's signal. I'm not going to play this game, Luke called out towards the vision. I'm not. I've faced this crisis too, and I've defeated it. But his words seemed dead even in his own ears, and even as he spoke them, he could feel the jab of the guard's spear in his back, and could feel himself drop off the end of the plank. In midair, he twisted around, grabbing the end of the board and flipping high over the guards' heads. He landed and turned back towards the sail barge, hand extended for the lightsaber R2 had sent just arcing towards him. It never reached him. Even as he stood there waiting for it, the weapon changed direction, curving back towards the other end of the sail barge. Frantically, Luke reached out for it with the Force, but to no avail. The lightsaber continued its flight, and came to rest in the hand of a slender woman standing alone at the top of the barge. Luke stared at her, a feeling of horror surging through him. In the mists, with the sun behind her, he could see no details of her face, but the lightsaber she now held aloft like a prize told him all he needed to know. She had the power of the Force, and had just condemned him and his friends to death. And as the spears pushed him again onto the plank, he heard, clearly through the dream mists, her mocking laughter. No! Luke shouted, and as suddenly as it had appeared, the vision vanished. He was back in the cave on Dagobah, his forehead and tunic soaked with sweat, a frantic electronic beeping coming from the comlink in his hand. He took a shuddering breath, squeezing his lightsaber hard to reassure himself that he did indeed still have it. It's. He worked moisture into a dry throat and tried again. It's okay, R2, he reassured the droid. I'm all right. Uh, he paused, fighting through the disorientation to try to remember what he was doing here. Are you still picking up that electronic signal? R2 beeped affirmatively. Is it still ahead of me? Another affirmative beep. Okay, Luke said. Shifting the lightsaber in his hand, he wiped more of the sweat from his forehead and started cautiously forward, trying to watch all directions at once. But the cave had apparently done its worst. No more visions rose to challenge his way as he continued deeper in, and at last, R2 signaled that he was there. The device, once he'd finally pried it out of the mud and moss, was a distinct disappointment. A small, somewhat flattened cylinder, a little longer than his hand, with 5 triangular rust-encrusted keys on one side and some flowing alien script engraved on the other. This is it? Luke asked, not sure he liked the idea of having come all the way in here just for something so totally nondescript. There's nothing else? R2 beeped affirmatively and gave a whistle that could only be a question. I don't know what it is, Luke told the droid. Maybe you'll recognize it. Hang on, I'm coming out. The return trip was unpleasant, but also uneventful, and a short time later he emerged from under the tree roots with a sigh of relief into the relatively fresh air of the swamp. It had grown dark while he'd been inside, he noted to his mild surprise. That twisted vision of the past must have lasted longer than it had seemed. R2 had the X-Wing's landing lights on. The beams were visible as hazy cones in the air. Wading his way through the ground vegetation, Luke headed towards the X-Wing. R2 was waiting for him, beeping quietly to himself. The beeping became a relieved whistle as Luke came into the light, the little droid rocking back and forth like a nervous child. Relax, R2. I'm all right, Luke reassured him, squatting down and putting the flattened cylinder out of his side pocket. What do you think? The droid chirped thoughtfully, his dome swiveling around to examine the object from a couple of different directions. Then, abruptly, the chirping exploded into an excited electronic jabbering. What? Luke asked, trying to read the flurry of sounds and wondering wryly why 3PO was never around when you needed him. Slow down, R2. I can't. Never mind, he interrupted himself, getting to his feet and glancing around in the gathering darkness. I don't think there's any point in hanging around here anymore anyway. He looked back at the cave, now almost swallowed up by the deepening gloom, and shivered. No, there was no reason to stay, and at least one very good reason to leave. So much, he thought glumly, for finding any kind of enlightenment here. He should have known better. Come on, he told the droid. Let's get you back into your socket. You can tell me all about it on the way home. R2's report on the cylinder was, it turned out, fairly short and decidedly negative. The little droid did not recognize the design, could not decipher its function from what his general-purpose scanners could pick up, and didn't even know what language the script on the side was written in, let alone what it said. Luke was beginning to wonder what all the droid's earlier excitement had been about, until the last sentence scrolled across the computer scope. Lando. Luke frowned, reading the sentence again. I don't remember ever seeing Lando with anything like this. More words scrolled across the scope. Yes, I realize I was busy at the time, Luke agreed, unconsciously flexing the fingers of his artificial right hand. Getting fitted with a new hand will do that. So did he give it to General Madine, or was he just showing it to him? Another sentence appeared. That's okay, Luke assured the droid. I imagine you were busy too. He looked into his rear display, at the crescent of Dagobah growing ever smaller behind him. He had intended to go straight back to Coruscant and wait for Leia and Han to return from Bephash, but from what he'd heard, their mission there could run a couple of weeks or even more, and Lando had invited him more than once to visit his new rare ore mining operation at the superhot planet of Niklon. Change in plans, R2, he announced, keying in a new course. We're going to swing over to the Athega system and see Lando. Maybe he can tell us what this thing is. And on the way, he'd have time to think about that disturbing dream or vision or whatever it was that he'd had in the cave, and to decide whether it had been, in fact, nothing more than a dream. That's the end of the chapter. Hope you guys liked it. Talk to you soon.